Please, if you've seen my little girl, she has a soft brown bonnet, blue eyes, and she loves to sing to the birds. Please bring her home. We live on Hawthorne Street. We will reward you. God bless you. That's not a line from a movie. That's a real message from a real mother, written in 1871, published in the back pages of a local Pennsylvania newspaper. No photo, no phone number, just desperation inked on a fragile sheet of paper. And that's how I fell into this timeline of missing persons. Not through a high-profile case, not through a Netflix documentary, but through a single sentence in brittle newsprint. She vanished on her way to buy a loaf of bread. That's all it took. One street corner, one moment, and she was gone. I tried to find out what happened to that girl, but there's no follow-up article, no arrest, no record of her ever being found. She simply disappeared. And for me, that was the beginning of something much darker, a question that still haunts me. How many vanished before we even knew what missing persons meant? The name Charlie Ross hits like a whisper through American true crime history. He was only 4 years old when he was taken from his front yard in Philadelphia, just days before Independence Day in the summer of 1874. Two men in a horse-drawn buggy had been watching him and his brother for days, offering candy, joking, building trust. Then one afternoon, they offered a ride. Charlie got in. His brother came back alone. The family was shattered. But this case, it was something different, something the country had never seen before. The Ross family printed thousands of posters. They plastered them across cities, handed them to travelers, nailed them to telegraph poles. It was the first known use of mass-printed missing child posters in the United States. But the tragedy didn't stop there. Weeks later, two burglars were shot in a failed break-in. One of them, dying in a hospital bed, confessed to the kidnapping of Charlie Ross, but refused to say where the boy was. And that was it. No body, no closure. Just a name, Charlie Ross, forever burned into the history of how we began to fight for the missing. Even now, there's a digital file in the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's Archive. Charlie's name is still there, unresolved. There were no Amber Alerts, no police coordination, no databases to cross-check sightings. If someone vanished in the late 1800s or early 1900s, your only weapon was noise and ink. I pored over old newspaper archives, and what I found wasn't justice, it was panic. Families ran classified ads next to furniture sales and crop prices. Desperate, trembling words printed beside the mundane. There was a pattern. Last seen wearing. Believed to be traveling with a stranger. Reward if found. Some families printed their child's name so many times that typesetters learned it by heart. Posters were nailed to church doors, fence posts, train stations, anywhere a stranger might look up and notice. But often, they didn't. There was no real law enforcement system for missing people. Each town had its own sheriff, its own rules. And if the victim crossed county lines, it was like the slate got wiped clean. Predators thrived in this chaos. They knew how slow everything was, how easily they could vanish into another city, another state. Sometimes they'd change their name and start over just miles away. I read about one child abducted in New York who was found years later in Ohio only because a teacher recognized the curve of her handwriting. Can you imagine that? No fingerprinting, no central files, just instincts and blind luck. And still, the worst was yet to come. The world already knew the name Charles Lindbergh, the Golden Aviator, the American hero. But on the night of March 1st, 1932, that name would become synonymous with one of the most chilling crimes in US history. I can still hear the creak of that wooden ladder, the sound of the nursery window being opened, the wind slipping through an empty crib. Lindbergh's 20-month-old son, Charles Jr., was taken from his crib while the family was downstairs. No witnesses, no forced entry, just a ransom note demanding $50,000 and a nation thrown into terror. This wasn't just another missing child. This was America's royalty. The press frenzy was unprecedented. Journalists camped outside the Lindbergh estate, microphones shoved into grieving faces, strangers claiming visions, dreams, clues. It was chaos again. But this time, the government couldn't ignore it. President Hoover ordered the FBI to get involved, even though at that time, kidnapping wasn't a federal crime. That would soon change. The ransom was paid, but weeks later, the toddler's body was found in the woods, bludgeoned to death, just a few miles from the house. The shockwaves were seismic. This single case led directly to the Federal Kidnapping Act, making it a federal offense to transport a kidnapped person across state lines. It was the beginning of coordinated national-level investigations, but it came at the cost of a baby's life. A moment when tragedy finally forced transformation. The Lindbergh kidnapping didn't just shake the public, it shook the entire legal system. That's when the Federal Kidnapping Act of 1932 was signed into law. Suddenly, if a person was abducted and moved across state lines, it became a federal crime. And the FBI at the time, a young agency with limited jurisdiction, was handed its first major role in missing persons investigations. I tracked down internal memos from the era. They're fascinating and frustrating. Agents documented how unprepared they were. The Bureau had no unified tracking system, no centralized records, no idea how to coordinate with state police. One memo from 1933 reads, "There is no reliable method of tracing the victim once they are transported beyond the original district. We rely solely on external notification." Translation: if the local cops didn't call the FBI didn't know. This gap let dozens, maybe hundreds of victims slip into silence. There were also limitations on who mattered. The Bureau focused heavily on high-profile cases, rich families, national headlines, crimes with interstate implications. But the everyday disappearances, the working-class victims, they were still someone else's problem. That's when I realized, even with the FBI now on the field, the rules were still broken, and they were about to break even harder. I couldn't believe it at first. I read case after case. A woman disappears after leaving work. A man vanishes during a road trip. A teenager runs away and is never heard from again. In each report, the tone was the same. No evidence of foul play. No further action. The default assumption: they left voluntarily. That's how adults were treated, even when families were screaming for help, even when it was wildly out of character, even when there were signs of danger. If you were over 18, the response was cold and mechanical. Adults have the right to disappear. Legally, that's true. But what about when they don't pack a bag, don't take money, don't say goodbye? I spoke to a retired detective from the 1970s. He admitted, "We used to wait 72 hours before even filing a report. If it was a grown man, we'd shrug it off. We thought most people would come back on their own." But many never did. This cultural blind spot, this refusal to treat adult disappearances with urgency, allowed serial predators to flourish undetected. Victims like Maura Murray, Jason Jolkowski, Susan Powell, they weren't considered high priority until it was too late. And honestly, it still happens today. She had a name, she had a family, and she had a place she called home. But for more than a decade, she was just a body in a morgue. A Jane Doe with a number on a toe tag. No one connected the dots. Her name was Tammy Jo Alexander. In 1979, her body was found in a field in Livingston County, New York, shot once in the head. She was a teenager, no ID. Her jacket was from California. Her jeans were popular in Florida, but no one could figure out who she was. Meanwhile, across the country in Florida, her childhood best friend never stopped looking. For years, she contacted police. She begged them to compare the details, but they had no access to the records in New York. The systems didn't talk to each other. The database didn't exist. That's the moment I realized how fragile this entire system was. In 2007, a quiet revolution began. After thousands of similar tragedies, NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, was born. Finally, families, coroners, law enforcement, and even the public could upload photos, dental records, DNA, scars, tattoos, anything that might help connect the dots. And in 2015, someone did. Tammy Jo Alexander was identified through NamUs more than 35 years after her murder. The friend who never gave up was right. All it took was a shared database and someone willing to look. But how many others are still out there waiting? There are over 40,000 unidentified human remains in the United States right now. Let that sink in. 40,000 people whose names have been stripped away, never matched to a missing persons report, never claimed, never buried with dignity. I visited a cold storage morgue once just outside of Chicago. The smell of antiseptic, the hum of fluorescent lights, and then the silence, the overwhelming silence. Rows of drawers holding bones, partial skulls, clothing in evidence bags. Some of these remains had been there since the 1960s. I found forensic sketches of women with hollow eyes, reconstructed faces made of clay and digital composites, some smiling, some frozen in fear. I couldn't stop staring. Each one looked real, alive, like someone I might have passed on the street yesterday. And yet, no name, no story, no justice. I learned that DNA isn't always processed. Many counties can't afford it. Others don't prioritize it. Some don't even know what NamUs is. This is the hidden tragedy of the missing persons crisis. It's not just the people who vanish. It's the ones who are found, but never recognized. And every year, that silent army grows. She was 9 years old. Amber Hagerman had been riding her pink bike near an abandoned grocery store in Arlington, Texas. It was January 13th, 1996. She was only a few feet away from her brother when a black pickup truck pulled up. A man got out, grabbed her, and drove off. Witnesses screamed. Her brother ran for help. Police arrived quickly, but not fast enough. Amber was found 4 days later, her body dumped in a creek. She'd been sexually assaulted and murdered. The city was shattered, but the grief wasn't quiet, it ignited a firestorm. At the funeral, Amber's mother asked a question no one could ignore. Why didn't we have a system to warn people? That question changed everything. Soon after, broadcasters and law enforcement teamed up to create what would become the Amber Alert system, named in Amber's memory. It wasn't just a notification, it was a race against time. Details of a suspected abduction would instantly hit TV, radio, and eventually cell phones. Highways would light up with license plates. Whole cities would be on high alert. For the first time, reaction time became a weapon. And it worked. Hundreds of children have been saved because of Amber Alerts. But still, Amber's killer has never been found. To this day, her case remains unsolved. Her name lives on not in justice, but in a warning system designed to make sure no one else disappears without a fight. By the early 2000s, something started to shift. Not inside police stations, but online. In the shadows of message boards and crude websites, a new kind of investigator was born. I remember scrolling through web sleuths and Doe Network in those early years. Grainy photos, forum threads 100 pages long, the passion unmatched. These weren't professionals, they were mothers, truckers, college students, retired nurses, people with laptops and obsession. They pored over timelines, compared facial features, matched tattoos, analyzed metadata in blurry photos. Some of them even learned forensic anthropology on their own time just to give a name to a Jane Doe. One user spent years connecting a missing teen in California to an unidentified body in Nevada and solved the case before police did. Another compared a child's birthmark to a morgue sketch and was right. They weren't guessing, they were working. This was the beginning of something radical, the public refusing to sit on the sidelines. Forums became digital war rooms. Cold cases were pulled out of obscurity. And behind every user avatar was someone who just wanted the missing to be found even if they'd never met them. It wasn't always clean, it wasn't always accurate, but sometimes these amateurs were the only ones still looking. It used to take days to print a flyer. Now it takes seconds to broadcast a disappearance to millions. I scroll through TikTok videos with dramatic voiceovers, Instagram reels showing missing faces framed with music and jump cuts, Twitter threads unraveling case details in real time, often faster than the police. We're not waiting anymore. The world is watching now. When Gabby Petito disappeared, I watched the internet mobilize like a digital SWAT team. Reddit detectives pulling up campsite satellite imagery, TikTokers geo-locating her van. A travel vlogger's footage ended up providing the clue that led to her body. Incredible. But then I saw something darker. A random post. Where is the same energy for missing indigenous women? I paused, started digging, and the cracks in this revolution started to show. Because sometimes social media doesn't solve cases, it drowns them. Wrong names, fake sightings, accusations without evidence, people chasing clout instead of truth. Entire investigations derailed because of a viral lie. The power is real, but so is the chaos. We can spread hope, or we can spread noise. And the difference between the two, it's not always easy to see. Let me tell you about two disappearances that happened on the same day, same state, same time frame, same age group. One of them made national headlines. Her photo was everywhere. News vans, talk shows, dedicated hashtags. The other didn't even get a police press conference. Why? That's the question that won't let me go. I dug into the numbers. White women get the most media coverage in missing persons cases. Black women, indigenous women, LGBTQ plus individuals, largely ignored. There's even a name for it now, missing white woman syndrome. Coined by journalists, acknowledged by experts. It's not just a hunch, it's documented bias. The deeper I looked, the worse it got. Socioeconomic status matters. Attractiveness matters. Criminal history, even if it's irrelevant, matters. Some families have to fight for years just to get a reporter to pick up their child's name. Others, one tweet goes viral and the world comes running. It's uncomfortable, but it's true. And until we face that, the system stays rigged. Some people are searched for like they're gold. Others are buried in silence before they're even found. The first time I watched it happen, I got chills. I was sitting across from a forensic genealogist in a dimly lit lab, walls covered in family trees, each branch built from blood, hair, and heartbreak. We don't just find suspects, she told me. We find identities, lost names, missing stories. It all started to change in 2018 when the Golden State Killer, a sadistic predator who had terrorized California in the 70s and 80s, was finally unmasked. And it wasn't fingerprints. It wasn't an eyewitness. It wasn't some smoking gun. It was a second cousin's DNA uploaded to a public genealogy site. Joseph James Dingelow, a retired cop, had been hiding in plain sight for decades, but his family tree gave him away. I followed the path step by step, how genealogists built his identity backwards, one ancestor at a time, cross-referencing open-source databases and public records. It took months, but when they finally found a match, it felt like science fiction turned real. Now, that same technology is being used across the country to identify Jane Does, to crack cold cases, to confirm beyond a shadow of doubt who someone really is. It's revolutionary. But it also raises a question that lingers in the back of my mind. If our DNA can speak for us after death, who's listening and who's watching? They didn't find her body because of a clue. They didn't find it because of a confession. They found her because her cell phone pinged a tower she never should have been near. Welcome to the surveillance age. Every movement leaves a trace now. Cameras on gas stations, ring doorbells in sleepy suburbs, license plate readers, fitness trackers logging every heartbeat and step. I followed a case where a woman vanished after leaving a friend's house. The suspect swore he never saw her again, but his car's GPS said otherwise. A late-night stop in a remote patch of woods. No reason. No witnesses. Just data. When officers checked the location, they found shallow, disturbed soil. She was there, buried exactly where the car had paused for 7 minutes. It sounds cold, mechanical, but sometimes machines remember what humans forget. In another case, a killer was caught when his smartwatch logged his heart rate spiking during the murder. Another when a ring camera across the street recorded the abduction, even though the suspect had no idea it was even there. This technology is everywhere, and it's changing everything. But here's the twist. It's not always enough to stop a disappearance. Sometimes it just lets us watch it happen. There's a moment in every case where I have to stop and ask a brutal question. What if they meant to disappear? Not all missing persons are taken. Some walk away. On purpose. Planned. Calculated. I spoke with a former investigator who told me the most frustrating cases aren't the ones with no clues. They're the ones where everything looks like a crime until you realize it was a controlled exit. I started looking deeper, and what I found was chilling. Psychological vanishings. Cases where trauma pushed someone to erase themselves. Where the pressure of life, identity, relationships became so unbearable, the only escape was to vanish entirely. Like the man who faked his own drowning to avoid death. The woman who started a new life under a false name 5 states away after a breakdown. Even runaways with GPS jammers, deliberately hiding from family for reasons no one understands. But the most disturbing ones, the manipulators, those who vanish to punish, to scare, to gain control over the people they leave behind. Weaponize a disappearance. They're the reason law enforcement hesitates. Because without foul play, without proof, a missing person is just a ghost with rights. It's uncomfortable, but it's real. And it reminds me sometimes the mystery isn't in the evidence, it's in the mind. I stood in a mother's living room once. It had been 11 years since her daughter vanished, but the bedroom, still exactly the same. Posters on the wall, a worn-out teddy bear on the bed, her favorite hoodie folded neatly on the dresser waiting. She still sets a plate for her every Thanksgiving. Still updates the voicemail on her daughter's old phone. Still dreams of her walking through the front door like nothing ever happened. That's the part the statistics don't show. The emotional toll. The weight of maybe. When someone dies, you grieve. When someone disappears, you wait. Every phone call could be them. Every knock on the door. Every stranger's face. I met a father who got a heart attack every time the news mentioned an unidentified body. He'd call the precinct again and again. Please check the teeth. Please check the scar on her ankle. And most times, it wasn't her. But he kept calling. Because when you don't have a body, you don't bury hope. You live inside it. And that's the part of this story that hurts the most. It's the phrase that still rattles me. Case closed, presumed runaway. I used to think those words meant finality until I started revisiting the files. Like Shannon Gilbert, dismissed as just another escort who freaked out and ran. But months later, investigators searching for her stumbled upon 10 other bodies along Ocean Parkway. They hadn't just lost Shannon, they'd missed a serial killer. Or Phoenix Golden, 23, vanished from her driveway in broad daylight. Her car was found still running. But authorities assumed she left voluntarily despite her purse, keys, and glasses being inside. No investigation. No urgency. Case closed. Too often, the assumption of just a runaway erases the need to dig deeper. The victim's history is weaponized against them. Troubled past. Known to leave home. Probably fine. But when the truth finally surfaces, murder, abuse, trafficking, it's always too late. I went through reports where the missing had cried for help before vanishing. Hospital visits, police calls, bruises, and still no red flags raised. So many could have been saved if someone had just stayed curious. There's something sacred about an old case file. The creased edges, the faded ink, the yellowed photos clipped to handwritten notes. I opened one from 1984. The pages smelled like mildew and desperation. Inside were phone logs, shoe impressions, a map drawn by hand. But what caught me was a note in the margin. That detective never solved it. But decades later, someone else picked it up armed with DNA tools he never had. A single strand of hair preserved in evidence. One run through a new genealogy database and a name emerged. Case closed for real this time. This happens more and more now. Technology revives the forgotten. Public pressure, online sleuths, podcasters, family Facebook groups forces cold cases back into the spotlight. Some departments even have full-time cold squads now, dedicated to solving what once seemed unsolvable. Because in truth, time doesn't kill a case. Complacency does. This part haunts me most. Why do people disappear? Sometimes it's abduction, a predator lurking, planning, watching. Other times it's trauma, something inside a person snaps and escape becomes survival. There's coerced silence too. Victims in cults, domestic abuse survivors trapped in invisible prisons. They're missing but still alive, just not allowed to be found. I studied profiles, spoke to forensic psychologists. They told me about high-risk lifestyles, flight behaviors, intentional vanishing thresholds. But behind the terms are real people. People with breaking points. People who thought vanishing was their only option. It's terrifying how fragile identity is. A wrong turn, a bad date, a controlling partner. And suddenly, someone's gone. Not in a flash, but in a slow fade, piece by piece. And what scares me most, we often don't notice until it's too late. I've spent months unraveling this time capsule. Each case a page, each clue a scar. But I still can't shake these final questions. Why are so many cases still misclassified? How many victims were written off too fast, filed away under the wrong label, never to be searched for again? What happens to the ones no one's looking for? The forgotten, the voiceless, the ones without headlines, hashtags, or hope. And the biggest one of all, in a world full of cameras, satellites, and DNA, how does someone still vanish without a trace? I don't have the answers, but I won't stop asking, and neither should you.